In this video, we're going to see how to move a selection in Photoshop Elements from one area of a photo to a different area. We'll also see how to move a selection from one photo to a different photo. This can save you from taking the time to make a new selection when you already made one that will work in a different location. Hi, I'm Rick from EssentialPhotoshopElements.com. Let's go over to Photoshop Elements and get started. I'm using Photoshop Elements 14 for this video, but it'll work with other versions as well. Let's say that we want to make two of the large octagon tiles in the middle of this photo, similar in color to the greenish blue tiles on the outside ends of the photo. There's a couple different ways that you could do that, but this tutorial isn't about changing color as much as it is about how to move a selection. So let's start by making the Color Picker tool active by clicking on it in the toolbox. It's this one that looks like an eyedropper, so I'll click on it. Now I'll move my cursor over one of the green tiles and click on it, and I'm going to choose this darker green. And when I do that, that loads that color where I clicked into the foreground color. Next, we'll go over to the Layers panel and add a new blank layer by clicking on the Create a New Layer icon. Let's go back to the toolbox to get a selection tool to make the selection with. For this selection, since our octagon tile is formed by a series of straight lines, I'm going to use the Polygonal Lasso tool. In the Select section of the toolbox, I see the regular lasso tool, and I know that the Polygonal Lasso tool and also the Magnetic Lasso tool all share that same space in the toolbox. So I'll need to click on the Lasso tool first, which I'll do. And then I can go down to the tool options and select the Polygonal Lasso tool from down there. Let's zoom in a little closer to make the selection. I'll press Command plus sign on a Mac, or it would be Control plus sign on a PC. You can see that the cursor looks like the Polygonal Lasso tool with an arrow next to it. The way this tool works is you click a series of points, and those points are connected to each other with a straight line to form a path. And then to close the path and complete your selection, you move your cursor over your first point, and you'll see a tiny circle appear to indicate that you're over the first point. Then you just click once and the path is turned into a selection as indicated by the marching ants. Just for a quick demo, I'll make a few clicks so you can see how it works. So I can click once, and I'll click again, and I'll click here, and then I'll return to the starting point, and when I get over it, you see that little circle appear next to my cursor? That tells me that I'm over my starting point now, so I can click here to close my selection. I'm going to undo the selection by pressing Command D on a Mac, or it would be Control D on a PC for deselect. One other thing before I make the selection, with the current cursor, I find that sometimes I have a hard time telling if I actually have the cursor positioned where I want to click a point. There's another option for the cursor that I prefer to use, and you can switch to that option by pressing the Caps Lock key on your keyboard to turn it on. So watch the cursor, and I'll press my Caps Lock key. Now the cursor looks like a crosshairs with a tiny dot in the center. And that dot is now the cursor's hotspot. So I can move my cursor so that the dot is over the spot where I want to add a point. I just find it easier to see that. So if we're ready to make our selection, I'm just going to reposition my photo so I can see this octagon tile right here, which is the one that I'm going to make a selection around. And I'll click my first point in the upper left corner of this tile. Then I'll move the cursor down to where the shape takes a turn, right here, and I'll click another point. And then I'll move down to the next corner and click there. And you see how it's kind of going off of that line that I'm over right now? I want it to be more in the center of that line, so I'm going to undo my last click. And you can do that by pressing either the Delete key on a Mac or the backspace key on a PC. So I'll click on the Delete key, and that just got rid of that last point that I clicked. I'll click right here. To make sure I get on that line, instead of trying to go all the way to this corner, I'm just going to move it over so it's on that line where I want it to be, and I can click right there. And then I'll go down to this corner and click, and I'll put a point here, and I'm going to get on my line and put a point there, and then go to the next corner, click another point. I'll do one here and here, and now I just move over towards where I made my first point, and I watch for that little circle to appear, and there it is right there. So now I know I can click to close my path and make my selection, so I'll do that. And you can see that I have a selection now as indicated by the marching ants. Now I want to fill the selection with that greenish color that we loaded as our foreground color earlier. And a little tip for quickly filling a selection with the foreground color is that you can press Option Delete on a Mac, or it would be Alt Backspace on a PC. I'm going to press Option Delete, and my selection is filled with the foreground color. It looks kind of weird right now because it's just that flat color without any detail, but we'll fix that in a little bit. We still have the other octagon tile to select and change the color. Since all of the tiles are basically the same size and shape, instead of making another selection, we can use the one that we already have. All we have to do is move the selection over a tile that we want to change and fill it with the foreground color. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. Let's pretend that we want to make this tile down and to the right of the one we filled. We also want to fill that one. At this point, you might naturally think that to move the selection, you should go over to the toolbox and make the Move tool active to move it. So let's do that. We'll click on the Move tool, and then place the cursor anywhere inside of the selection and click and drag it to the next tile. Well, that sort of worked because it did move the selection, but the problem is that it also moved all of those green pixels that are inside of the selection. We wanted the green to stay on that first tile and just move the selection to the next tile so that we could also fill that area with green. I'm going to undo that. To move just the selection, you can't use the Move tool, ironically. You have to use one of the selection tools, but it can't be any selection tool. Let's look over at the Select section in the toolbox and see which ones will work for moving a selection. There's 4 tool spots in the Select section. We already know that the Move tool won't move just the selection. It turns out that either of the marquee tools can be used to move a selection, and there's 2 of them that share the space in the upper right quadrant of the Select section. They're the elliptical marquee and the rectangular marquee tools. You can also use any of the lasso tools to move a selection. And there's 3 different lasso tools. There's the regular lasso tool, the polygonal lasso, and the magnetic lasso tools. And they all share that lower left quadrant in the Select section of the toolbox. None of the tools in the lower right space can be used to move a selection. So there's 5 total, the 2 marquee tools and the 3 lasso tools. One other rule you need to observe to move a selection is that the cursor needs to be placed inside of the selection before you click and drag it. If you use one of those 5 tools but click outside of the selected area on your photo, the selection will go away because Photoshop Elements thinks that you want to start a new selection where you click. I'll click on the marquee tool to make it active. Let's place the cursor inside of the selected area. Notice that as soon as our cursor gets inside the selection, the cursor icon changes to a little dotted outline with an arrowhead next to it. That's another indication that the cursor can now be used to move the selection by clicking and dragging. So I'll click and drag it down and place it over this other octagon tile. And this time it did what we wanted to do. It left the green pixels back on the first tile, and it just moved the selection over to the second tile. You can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge the selection into place when you have one of those 5 tools active. I'll do that to get it to fit as best I can. That looks pretty good. Actually, the size of these tiles varies very slightly because the grout lines in between the tiles vary slightly, but they're really close to being exact. Now we can press Option Delete or Alt Backspace to fill the new area with the foreground color. And even though this isn't a tutorial about changing color, just to show you how I would do this, I'm going to go over to the Layers panel and change the blend mode from normal to color. And now the detail comes back into those tiles. We can zoom back out by pressing Command -sign on a Mac or Control -sign on a PC so that we can see the whole photo. Another thing I want to show you is that you can move a selection not only to a different area within the same photo, but you can also move it to a completely different photo. I have two different photos open in Photoshop Elements right now. You can see up at the top of the window that there are two tabs, one for each photo. Another way you can tell how many photos are currently open in Elements is to go down to the lower left of your window and click on Photo Bin. When I do that, the Tool Options panel is replaced by the Photo Bin. You can always get back to the Tool Options by clicking right down here where it says Tool Options. But right now we want the Photo Bin to be showing. The Photo Bin displays a thumbnail of any photo that you currently have open in Elements. The photo that's currently active has a light blue border around its thumbnail, and it's also the one you see up in the active image area. You can change which photo is active just by clicking on its thumbnail in the Photo Bin. So if I click on this other thumbnail, then it gets the blue border around it and it becomes visible in the active image area up here. This is actually a photo I made out of the other photo. I just inverted the colors to their opposite values so that we can easily tell them apart. Let's go back to our first photo. Let's say that we want to make a color change to two of the octagon tiles in the other photo, similar to what we did in this photo. But just to mix it up a little, let's change two different tiles. Since we know that the octagons are the same size in both photos, we realize that we can use the same selection that we already made. And it's really easy to move our selection to the other photo. All we have to do is first make sure that we have one of those 5 selection tools that we identified earlier as allowing us to move a selection. I do have the marquee tool still active, so we're good there. Then all you have to do is click anywhere inside of the selection and continue holding down the mouse button as you drag your cursor down to the Photo Bin. And when your cursor gets over the thumbnail of the photo that you want to move the selection to, just release the mouse button. So let's do that. I'll put my cursor inside of the selection and then I'll click and drag it down to the Photo Bin right on top of that other thumbnail of that other photo, and then I'll let go of the mouse button. And when I do, that other photo becomes the active photo, and you can see that we now have that selection that we dragged from the other photo. And notice that our selection is in the same spot as it was in the first photo. The selection isn't just moved to the other photo, it actually copied it, meaning we still have the selection active in the other photo. If I click on that, you can still see the active selection there too. So now I'll just add a new layer in the Layers panel and then switch to the Color Picker tool. And I'll click on this darker color over on the left edge of the photo to load it into our foreground color. Now to move the selection, I'll make the polygonal lasso tool active again, because remember that's one of the 5 that we can use. And then click and drag inside the selection to move it to a different tile. I'll move it up here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And then I'll use the arrow keys on my keyboard to nudge it over a bit. That looks pretty good, so I'll fill it with the foreground color by pressing Option Delete or Alt Backspace. Let's click and drag inside of the selection and move it down to this tile, and then I'll nudge it into place and fill it with the foreground color. Let's change the blend mode to color. And I'll zoom back out, and we're done. I'm going to switch back to the photo bin and click on our first photo just to show that the selection is still active and it's in the same area of the photo that we last left it. So that wraps up this video about how to move a selection in Photoshop Elements. Until next time, this is Rick from EssentialPhotoshopElements.com saying take care.